Part 1, Chapter 6b of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Julia Albert. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 6b, Devil's Work, continued. From the Blue Dragon to Chang Foo's was not far, and Jimmie Dale covered the distance in well under 5 minutes. Chang Foo's was just a tea merchant's shop, innocuous and innocent enough in its appearance, blatantly so indeed, and that was all, outwardly. But Jimmie Dale, as he reached his destination, experienced the first sensation of uplift he had known that night, and this from what, apparently, did not in the least seem like a contributing cause. "Luck! The blessed luck of it," he muttered grimly, as he surveyed the sightseeing car drawn up at the curb and watched the passengers crowding out of it to the ground. It wouldn't have been as easy to fool old Chang as it was that fellow back at the Dragon. And, besides, if I can work it, there's a better chance this way of getting out alive. The guide was marshalling his gapers, some 24 in all, men and women. Jimmie Dale unostentatiously fell in at the rear, and, the guide leading, the little crowd passed into the tea merchant's shop. Chang Foo, a wizened, wrinkled-faced little celestial, oily, suave, greeted them with profuse bows, chattering the while volubly in Chinese. The guide made the introduction with an all-embracing sweep of his hand. "Chang Foo, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, then held up his hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said impressively, "this is one of the most notorious, if not THE most notorious dive in Chinatown, and it is only through special arrangement with the authorities and at great expense that the company is able exclusively to gain an entry here for its patrons. You will see here the real life of the Chinese, and in half an hour you will get what few would get in a lifetime spent in China itself. You will see the Chinese children dance and perform, the Chinese women at their household tasks, the Joss, the shrine of his hallowed ancestors, at which Chang Foo here worships, and you will enter the most famous opium den in the United States. Now, if you will all keep close together, we will make a start." In spite of his desperate situation, Jimmie Dale smiled a little whimsically. Yes, they would see it all, upstairs. The same old bunk dished out night after night at so much a head, and the nervous little schoolma'am of uncertain age who fidgeted now beside him would go back somewhere down in Maine and shiver while she related her wider experiences in tremulous whispers into the shocked ears of envious other maiden ladies of equally uncertain age. The same old bunk, and a profitable one for Chang Foo for more reasons than one. It was dust in the eyes of the police. The police smiled knowingly at mention of Chang Foo. Who should know, if they didn't, that it was all harmless fake, all bunk? And so it was, upstairs. They were passing out of the shop now, bowed out through a side door by the obsequious and oily Chang Foo, and now they massed again in a sort of little hallway, and Chang Foo, closing the door upon Jimmie Dale, who was the last in the line, shuffled back behind the counter in his shop to resume his guard duty over customers of quite another ilk. With the door closed, it was dark, pitch dark. And this, too, like everything else connected with Chang Foo's establishment, for more reasons than one, for effect and for security. Nervous little twitters began to emanate from the women. The guide's voice rose reassuringly. "Keep close together, ladies and gentlemen. We're going upstairs now to—" Jimmie Dale hugged back against the wall, sidled along it, and like a shadow slipped down to the end of the hall. The scuffling of 24 pairs of feet mounting the creaky staircase drowned the slight sound as he cautiously opened a door. The darkness lay back, impenetrable, along the hall, and then, as cautiously as he had opened it, he closed the door behind him, and stood for an instant listening at the head of a ladder-like stairway, his automatic in his hand now. It was familiar ground to Larry the Bat. The steps led down to a cellar, and diagonally across from the foot of the steps was an opening, ingeniously hidden by a heterogeneous collection of odds and ends, boxes, cases, and rubbish from the pseudo tea shop above, a low opening in the wall to a passage that led on through the cellars of perhaps half a dozen adjoining houses, each of which latter was leased, in one name or another, by Chang Foo. Jimmie Dale crept down the steps, and in another moment had gained the farther side of the cellar. Then, skirting around the ruck of cases, he stooped suddenly and passed in through the opening in the wall. And now he halted once more. He was straining his eyes down a long, narrow passage, whose blackness was accentuated rather than relieved by curious wavering, gossamer threads of yellow light that showed here and there from under makeshift thresholds, from doors slightly ajar. Faint noises came to him, a muffled, intermittent clink of coin, a low, continuous droning hum of voices. The sickly sweet smell of opium pricked at his nostrils. Jimmie Dale's face set rigidly. It was the resort not only of the most depraved Chinese element, but of the worst white thugs that made New York their headquarters. Here, in the succession of cellars, roughly partitioned off to make a dozen rooms on either side of the passage, dope fiends sucked at the drug, and Chinese gamblers spent the greater part of their lives. Here, murder was hatched and played too often to its hellish end. Here, the scum of the underworld sought refuge from the police to the profit of Chang Foo, and here, somewhere, in one of these rooms, was the Wowzer. The Wowzer. Jimmie Dale stole forward silently, without a sound, swiftly, pausing only to listen for a second's space at the doors as he passed. From this one came that clink of coin, from another that jabber of Chinese, from still another that overpowering stench of opium, and once, iron-nerved as he was, a cold thrill passed over him. Let this lair of hell's wolves, so intent now on their own affairs, be once aroused, as they certainly must be roused before he could hope to finish the Wowzer, and his chance of escape were. He straightened suddenly, alert, tense, strained. Voices, raised in a furious quarrel, came from a door just behind him on the other side of the passage, where a film of light streamed out through a cracked panel. It was the Wowzer and Dago Jim. And drunk, both of them, and both in a blind fury. It happened quick then, almost instantaneously it seemed to Jimmie Dale. He was crouched now close against the door, his eye to the crack in the panel. There was only one figure in sight, Dago Jim, standing beside a table on which burned a lamp, the tabletop littered with watches, purses, and small chatelaine bags. The man was lurching unsteadily on his feet, a vicious sneer of triumph on his face, waving tauntingly an open letter and Jimmie Dale's pocketbook in his hands, waving them presumably in the face of the Wowzer, whom, from the restrictions of the crack, Jimmie Dale could not see. He was conscious of a sickening sense of disaster. His hope against hope had been In vain. The letter had been opened and read. The identity of the Gray Seal was solved. Dago Jim's voice roared out, hoarse, blasphemous, in drunken rage. "The Gray Seal, see? Youse bet your life I knows. I been waitin' for somethin' like this, damn youse. Youse been stallin' on me for a year every time it came to a divvy. You've got a pocketful now, you snitch tonight, that youse are tryin' to do me out of. Well, keep 'em." He shoved his face forward. "I keep this, see? Keep 'em, Wowzer, you cross-eyed." "Everything I pinched tonight's on the table there wid what youse pinched yourself," cut in the Wowzer, in a sullen, threatening growl. "Youse lie and youse know it," retorted Dago Jim. "Youse have given me the short end every time we've pulled a deal." "Dat letter's mine, youse," bawled the Wowzer furiously. "Why didn't youse open it and read it, then, instead of lettin' me do it to keep me busy while youse shortchanged me?" sneered Dago Jim. "Youse thought it was some sweet billy do, eh? Well, thanks, Wowzers, dat's what it is. Say," he mocked, "dere's a guy'll cash 1,000 century notes fer dis, an' if he don't say dere's some reward out for de Gray Seal, wouldn't youse like to know who it is? Well, when I'm ridin' in me private buzz wagon, Wowzer, you'll stick around an' mabbe I'll tell youse, an' mabbe I won't." "By God!" The Wowzer's voice rose in a scream. "Youse hand over dat letter! Youse go to!" Red, lurid red, a stream of flame seemed to cut across Jimmie Dale's line of vision, came the roar of a revolver shot, and, like a madman, Jimmie Dale flung his body at the door. Rickety at best, it crashed inward, half wrenched from its hinges, precipitating him inside. He recovered himself and leaped forward. The room was swirling with blue eddies of smoke. Dago Jim, hands flung up, still grasping the letter and pocketbook, pawed at the air, and plunged with a sagging lurch face downward to the floor. There was a yell and an oath from the Wowzer, the crack of another revolver shot, the hum of the bullet past Jimmie Dale's ear, the scorch of the tongue flame in his face, and he was upon the other. Screeching profanity, the Wowzer grappled, and, for an instant, the two men rocked, reeled, and swayed in each other's embrace. Then, both men losing their balance, they shot suddenly backward, the Wowzer, undermost, striking his head against the table's edge, and men, table, and lamp crashed downward in a heap to the floor. It had been no more, at most, than a matter of seconds since Jimmie Dale had hurled himself into the room, and now, with a gurgling sigh, the Wowzer's arm, that had been wound around Jimmie Dale's back and shoulders, relaxed, and from the blow on his head the man lay back inert and stunned. And then it seemed to Jimmie Dale as though pandemonium and reality and chaos at the touch of some devil's hand reigned around him. It was dark. No, not dark. A spurt of flame was leaping along the line of trickling oil from the broken lamp on the floor. It threw into ghastly relief the sprawled form of Dago Jim. Outside, from along the passageway, came a confused jangle of commotion, whispering voices, shuffling feet, the swish of Chinese garments, and the room itself began to spring into weird, flickering shadows that mounted and crept up the walls with the spreading fire. There was not a second to lose before the room would be swarming with that rush from the passageway, and there was still the letter, the pocketbook. The table had fallen half over Dago Jim. Jimmie Dale pushed it aside, tore the crushed letter and the pocketbook from the man's hand, and felt, with a grim, horrible sort of anxiety, for the other's heartbeat, for the verdict that meant life or death to himself. There was no sign of life. The man was dead. Jimmie Dale was on his feet now. A face, another and another, showed in the doorway. The Wowzer was regaining his senses, stumbling to his knees. There was one chance, just one, to take those crowding figures by surprise, and with a yell of "Fire!" Jimmie Dale sprang for the doorway. They gave way before his rush, tumbling back in their surprise against the opposite wall, and, turning, Jimmie Dale raced down the passageway. Doors were opening everywhere now, forms were pushing out into the semi-darkness, only to duck hastily back again as Jimmie Dale's automatic barked and spat a running fire of warning ahead of him, and then, behind, the Wowzer's voice shrieked out: "Soak him! Kill the guy! He's croaked Dago Jim! Put a hole in him! The—" Yells, a chorus of them, took up the refrain, then the rush of following feet, and the passageway seemed to racket as though a Gatling gun were in play with the fusillade of revolver shots. But Jimmie Dale was at the opening now, and, like a base runner plunging for the bag, he flung himself in a low dive through and into the open cellar beyond. He was on his feet, over the boxes, and dashing up the stairs in a second. The door above opened as he reached the top. Jimmie Dale's right hand shot out with a clubbed revolver, and with a grunt Chang Fu went down before the blow and the headlong rush. The next instant Jimmie Dale had sprung through the tea shop and was out on the street. A minute, 2 minutes more, and Chinatown would be in an uproar. Chang Fu would see to that, and the Wowzer would prod him on. The danger was far from over yet. And then, as he ran, Jimmie Dale gave a little gasp of relief. Just ahead, drawn up at the curb, stood a taxicab, waiting, probably for a private slumming party. Jimmie Dale put on a spurt, reached it, and wrenched the door open. "Quick!" he flung at the startled chauffeur. "The nearest subway station. There's a 10 spot in it for you. Quick, man! Quick! Here they come!" A crowd of Chinese, pouring like angry hornets from Chang Fu's shop, came yelling down the street, and the taxi took the corner on 2 wheels. And Jimmie Dale, panting, choking for his breath like a man spent, sank back against the cushions. But 5 minutes later it was quite another Jimmie Dale, composed, nonchalant, imperturbable, who entered an uptown subway train and, choosing a seat alone near the center of the car, which at that hour of night in the downtown district was almost deserted, took the crushed letter from his pocket. For a moment he made no attempt to read it. His dark eyes, now that he was free from observation, full of troubled retrospect, fixed on the window at his side. It was not a pleasant thought that it had cost a man his life, nor yet that that life was also the price of his own freedom. True, if there were 2 men in the city of New York whose crimes merited neither sympathy nor mercy, those 2 men were the Wowzer and Dago Jim. But yet, after all, it was a human life, and, even if his own had been in the balance, thank God it had been through no act of his that Dago Jim had gone out. The Wowzer, cute and cunning, had been quick enough to say so to clear himself, but Jimmie Dale smiled a little now. Neither the Wowzer, nor Chang Fu, nor Chinatown would ever be in a position to recognize their uninvited guest. Jimmie Dale's eyes shifted to the letter speculatively, gravely. It seemed as though the night had already held a year of happenings, and the night was not over yet. There was the letter. It had already cost 1 life. Was it to cast another, or what? It began as it always did. He read it through once, in amazement, a second time, with a flush of bitter anger creeping to his cheeks, and a third time, curiously memorizing, as it were, snatches of it here and there. Dear philanthropic crook. Robbery of Hudson Mercantile National Bank. Trusted employee is ex-convict. Bad police record. Served term in Sing Sing 3 years ago. Known to police as Bookkeeper Bob. Real name is Robert Moyne. Lives at Street, Harlem. Inspector Burton and Lanigan of headquarters trailing him now. Robbery not yet made public. There was a great deal more. 4 sheets of closely written data. With an exclamation almost of dismay, Jimmie Dale pulled out his watch. So that was what Burton and Lanigan were up to. And he had actually ran into them. Lord, the irony of it. And then Jimmie Dale stared at the dial of his watch incredulously. It was still but barely midnight. It seemed impossible that since leaving the theatre at a few minutes before 11 he had lived through but a single hour. Jimmie Dale's fingers began to pluck at the letter, tearing it into pieces, tearing the pieces over and over again into tiny shreds. The train stopped at station after station. People got on and off. Jimmie Dale's hat was over his eyes, and his eyes were glued again to the window. Had Bookkeeper Bob returned to his flat in Harlem with the detectives at his heels? Or were Burton and Lanigan still trailing the man downtown, somewhere around the cafes? If the former, the theft of the letter and its incident loss of time had been an irreparable disaster. If the latter, well, who knew? The risk was the Gray Seal's. At 125th Street, Jimmie Dale left the train, and, at the end of a sharp 4 minutes' walk, during which he had dodged in and out from street to street, stopped on a corner to survey the block ahead of him. It was a block devoted exclusively to flats and apartment houses, and, apart from a few belated pedestrians, was deserted. Jimmie Dale strolled leisurely down one side, crossed the street at the end of the block, and strolled leisurely back on the other side. There was no sign of either Burton or Lanigan. It was a fairly safe presumption, then, that Bookkeeper Bob had not returned yet, or one of the detectives at least would have been shadowing the house. Jimmie Dale, smiling a little grimly, retraced his steps again, and turned deliberately into a doorway, whose number he had noted as he had passed a moment or so before. So, after all, there was time yet. This was the house. Number 18, she had said in her letter. A flat, 3 stories. Moyne lives on the ground floor. Jimmie Dale leaned against the vestibule door. There was a faint click. A little steel instrument was withdrawn from the lock, and Jimmie Dale stepped into the hall, where a gas jet, turned down, burned dimly. The door of the ground floor apartment was at his right. Jimmie Dale reached up and turned off the light. Again those slim, tapering, wonderfully sensitive fingers worked with the little steel instrument, this time in the lock of the apartment door. Again there was that almost inaudible click, and then cautiously, inch by inch, the door opened under his hand. He peered inside, down a hallway lighted, if it could be called lighted at all, by a subdued glow from 2 open doors that gave upon it, peered intently, listening intently, as he drew a black silk mask from his pocket and slipped it over his face. And then, silent as a shadow in his movements, the door left just ajar behind him, he stole down the carpeted hallway. Opposite the first of the open doorways, Jimmie Dale paused. a curiously hard expression creeping over his face, his lips beginning to droop ominously downward at the corners. It was a little sitting room, cheaply but tastefully furnished, and a young woman, bookkeeper Bob's wife evidently, and evidently sitting up for her husband, had fallen sound asleep in a chair, her head pillowed on her arms that were outstretched across the table. For a moment Jimmie Dale held there, his eyes on the scene, and the next moment, his hand curved into a clenched fist, he had passed on and entered the adjoining room. It was a child's bedroom. A night lamp burned on a table beside the bed, and the soft rays seemed to play and linger in caress on the tousled golden hair of a little girl of perhaps 2 years of age. And something seemed to choke suddenly in Jimmie Dale's throat. The sweet, innocent little face, upturned to his, was smiling at him as she slept. Jimmie Dale turned away his head, his eyelashes wet under his mask. Beneath the mattress of the child's bed, the letter had said. His face like stone, his lips a thin line now, Jimmie Dale's hand reached deftly in without disturbing the child and took out a package, and then another. He straightened up, a bundle of crisp new $100 notes in each hand, and on the top of one, slipped under the elastic band that held the bills together, an unsealed envelope. He drew out the latter and opened it. It was a second-class steamship passage to Vera Cruz, made out in a fictitious name, of course, to John Davies, the booking for next day's sailing. From the ticket, from the stolen money, Jimmie Dale's eyes lifted to rest again on the little golden head, the smiling lips, and then, dropping the packages into his pockets, his own lips moved queerly, he turned abruptly to the door. "My God, the shame of it!" he whispered to himself. He crept down the corridor, past the open door of the room where the young woman still sat fast asleep, and, his mask in his pocket again, stepped softly into the vestibule, and from there to the street. Jimmie Dale hurried now, spurred on it seemed by a hot, insensate fury that raged within him. There was still one other call to make that night, still those remaining and minute details in the latter part of her letter, grim and ugly in their portent. End of Part 1, Chapter 6b. Part 1, Chapter 6c of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Julia Albert. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 6c, Devil's Work, concluded. It was close upon 1 o'clock in the morning when Jimmie Dale stopped again, this time before a fashionable dwelling just off Central Park. And here, for perhaps the space of a minute, he surveyed the house from the sidewalk, watching, with a sort of speculative satisfaction, a man's shadow that passed constantly to and fro across the drawn blinds of one of the lower windows. The rest of the house was in darkness. "Yes," said Jimmie Dale, nodding his head, "I rather thought so. The servants will have retired hours ago. It's safe enough." He ran quickly up the steps and rang the bell. A door opened almost instantly, sending a faint glow into the hall from the lighted room. A hurried step crossed the hall, and the outer door was thrown back. "Well, what is it?" demanded a voice brusquely. It was quite dark, too dark for either to distinguish the other's features, and Jimmie Dale's hat was drawn far down over his eyes. "I want to see Mr. Thomas H. Carling, cashier of the Hudson Mercantile National Bank. It's very important," said Jimmie Dale earnestly. "I am Mr. Carling," replied the other. "What is it?" Jimmie Dale leaned forward. "From headquarters, with a report," he said in a low tone. "Ah!" exclaimed the bank official sharply. "Well, it's about time. I've been waiting up for it, though I expected you would telephone rather than this. Come in." "Thank you," said Jimmie Dale courteously, and stepped into the hall. The other closed the front door. "The servants are in bed, of course," he explained as he led the way toward the lighted room. "This way, please." Behind the other, across the hall, Jimmie Dale followed, and close at Carling's heels entered the room, which was fitted up, quite evidently regardless of cost, as a combination library and study. Carling, in a somewhat pompous fashion, walked straight ahead toward the carved mahogany flat-top desk, and, as he reached it, waved his hand. "Take a chair," he said over his shoulder, and then, turning in the act of dropping into his own chair, grasped suddenly at the edge of the desk instead, and, with a low, startled cry, stared across the room. Jimmie Dale was leaning back against the door that was closed now behind him, and on Jimmie Dale's face was a black silk mask. For an instant neither man spoke nor moved. Then Carling, spare built, dapper in evening clothes, edged back from the desk and laughed a little uncertainly. "Quite neat, I compliment you. From headquarters with a report, I think you said." "Which I neglected to add," said Jimmie Dale, "was to be made in private." Carling, as though to put as much distance between them as possible, continued to edge back across the room, but his small black eyes, black now to the pupils themselves, never left Jimmie Dale's face. "In private, eh?" He seemed to be sparing for time, as he smiled. "In private! You've a strange method of securing privacy, haven't you? A bit melodramatic, isn't it? Perhaps you'll be good enough to tell me who you are." Jimmie Dale smiled indulgently. "My mask is only for effect," he said. "My name is Smith." "Yes," said Carling. "I'm very stupid. Thank you. He had reached the other side of the room now, and with a quick, sudden movement jerked his hand to the dial of the safe that stood against the wall. But Jimmie Dale was quicker. Without shifting his position, his automatic, whipped from his pocket, held a disconcerting bead on Carling's forehead. "Please don't do that," said Jimmie Dale softly. "It's rather a good make, that safe. I dare say it would take me half an hour to open it. I was rather curious to know whether it was locked or not." Carling's hand dropped to his side. "So," he sneered, "that's it, is it? The ordinary variety of sneak thief?" His voice was rising gradually. "Well, sir, let me tell you that—" "Mr. Carling," said Jimmie Dale, in a low, even tone, "unless you moderate your voice, someone in the house might hear you. I'm quite well aware of that. But if that happens, if anyone enters this room, if you make a move to touch a button, or in any other way attempt to attract attention, I'll drop you where you stand." His hand, behind his back, extracted the key from the door lock, held it up for the other to see, then dropped it into his pocket, and his voice, cold before, rang peremptorily now. "Come back to the desk and sit down in that chair," he ordered. For a moment Carling hesitated, then, with a half-muttered oath, obeyed. Jimmie Dale moved over and stood in front of Carling on the other side of the desk, and stared silently at the immaculate, fashionably groomed figure before him. Under the prolonged gaze, Carling's composure, in a measure at least, seemed to forsake him. He began to drum nervously with his fingers on the desk and shift uneasily in his chair. And then, from first one pocket and then the other, Jimmie Dale took the two packages of banknotes, and still without a word pushed them across the desk until they lay under the other's eyes. Carling's fingers stopped their drumming, slid to the desk edge, tightened there, and a whiteness crept into his face. Then, with an effort, he jerked himself erect in his chair. "What's this?" he demanded hoarsely. "About $10,000, I should say," said Jimmie Dale slowly. "I haven't counted it. Your bank was robbed this evening at closing time, I understand." "Yes!" Carling's voice was excited now, the color back in his face. "But you how do you mean that you are returning the money to the bank?" "Exactly," said Jimmie Dale. Carling was once more the pompous bank official. He leaned back and surveyed Jimmie Dale critically with his little black eyes. "Ah, quite so," he observed. "That accounts for the mask. But I am still a little in the dark. Under the circumstances, it is quite impossible that you should have stolen the money yourself, and—" "I didn't," said Jimmie Dale. "I found it hidden in the home of one of your employees." "You found it where?" "In Moyne's home, up in Harlem." "Moyne, eh?" Carling was alert, quick now, jerking out his words. "How did you come to get into this, then? His pal? Double crossing him, eh? I suppose you want a reward. We'll attend to that, of course. You're wiser than you know, my man. That's what we suspected. We've had the detectives trailing Moyne all evening." He reached forward over the desk for the telephone. "I'll telephone headquarters to make the arrest at once." "Just a minute," interposed Jimmie Dale gravely. "I want you to listen to a little story first." "A story? What has a story got to do with this?" snapped Carling. "The man has got a home," said Jimmie Dale softly. "A home and a wife and a little baby girl." "Oh, that's the game then, eh? You want to plead for him?" Carling flung out gruffly. "Well, he should have thought of all that before. It's quite useless for you to bring it up. The man has had his chance already, a better chance than any one with his record ever had before. We took him into the bank knowing that he was an ex-convict, but believing that we could make an honest man of him, and this is the result. And yet—" "No," said Carling icily. "You refuse? Absolutely?" Jimmie Dale's voice had a lingering, wistful note in it. "I refuse," said Carling bluntly. "I won't have anything to do with it." There was just an instant's silence, and then, with a strange, slow creeping motion, as a panther creeps when about to spring, Jimmie Dale projected his body across the desk, far across it toward the other, and the muscles of his jaw were quivering, his words rasping, choked with the sweep of fury that, held back so long, broke now in a passionate surge. "And shall I tell you why you won't? Your bank was robbed tonight of $100,000. There are 10,000 here. The other 90,000 are in your safe." "You lie!" ashen to the lips. Carling had risen in his chair. "You lie!" he cried. "Do you hear? You lie! I tell you, you lie!" Jimmie Dale's lips parted ominously. "Sit down!" he gritted between his teeth. The white in Carling's face had turned to gray. His lips were working. Mechanically he sank down again in his chair. Jimmie Dale still leaned over the desk, resting his weight on his right elbow, the automatic in his right hand covering Carling. "You cur," whispered Jimmie Dale. "There's just one reason, only one, that keeps me from putting a bullet through you while you sit there. We'll get to that in a moment. There is a little story first. Shall I tell it to you now? For the past 4 years, and God knows how many before that, you've gone the pace. The lavishness of this bachelor establishment of yours is common talk in New York, far in excess of a bank cashier's salary. But you were supposed to be a wealthy man in your own right, and so, in reality, you were, once. But you went through your fortune 2 years ago. Counted a model citizen, an upright man, an honour to the community. What were you, Carling? What ARE you? Shall I tell you? Rogue, gambler, leading a double life of the fastest kind. You did it cleverly, Carling, hid it well, but your game is up. Tonight, for instance, you are at the end of your tether, swamped with debts, exposure threatening you at any moment. Why don't you tell me again that I lie, Carling?" But now the man made no answer. He had sunk a little deeper in his chair, a dawning look of terror in the eyes that held, fascinated, on Jimmie Dale. "You cur," said Jimmie Dale again. "You cur, with your devil's work. A year ago you saw this night coming, when you must have money, or face ruin and exposure. You saw it then, a year ago, the day that Moyne, concealing nothing of his present record, applied through friends for a position in the bank. Your co-officials were opposed to his appointment, but do you remember how you pleaded to give the man his chance, and in your hellish ingenuity saw your way then out of the trap? An ex-convict from Sing Sing? It was enough, wasn't it? What chance had he?" Jimmie Dale paused, his left hand clenched until the skin formed whitish knobs over the knuckles. Carling's tongue sought his lips, made a circuit of them, and he tried to speak, but his voice was an incoherent muttering. "I'll not waste words," said Jimmie Dale in his grim monotone. "I'm not sure enough myself that I could keep my hands off you much longer. The actual details of how you stole the money today do not matter now. A little later, perhaps in court, but not now. You were the last to leave the bank, but before leaving you pretended to discover the theft of $100,000 that, done up in a paper parcel, was even then reposing in your desk. You brought the parcel home, put it in that safe there, and notifying the president of the bank by telephone from here of the robbery, suggesting that police headquarters be advised at once. He told you to go ahead and act as you saw best. You notified the police, speciously directing suspicious to the ex-convict in the bank's employ. You knew Moyne was dining out tonight, you knew where, and at a hint from you the police took up the trail. A little later in the evening you took these 2 packages of banknotes from the rest, and with this steamship ticket, which you obtained yesterday, while out at lunch, by sending a district messenger boy with the money and instructions in a sealed envelope to purchase for you, you went up to the Moynes' flat in Harlem for the purpose of secreting them somewhere there. You pretended to be much disappointed at finding Moyne out. You had just come for a little social visit to get better acquainted with the home life of your employees. Mrs. Moyne was genuinely pleased and grateful. She took you in to see the little girl, who was already asleep in bed. She left you there for a moment to answer the door, and you, Jimmie Dale's voice choked again, you plot on God's earth, you slipped the money and ticket under the child's mattress. Carling came forward with a lurch in his chair, and his hands went out, pawing in a wild, pleading fashion over Jimmie Dale's arm. Jimmie Dale flung him away. "You were safe enough," he rasped on. "The police could only construe your visit to Moyne's flat as zeal on behalf of the bank. And it was safer, much more circumspect on your part, not to order the flat searched at once, but only as a last resort, as it were, after you had led the police to trail him all evening and still remain without a clue, and besides, of course, not until you had planted the evidence that was to damn him and wreck his life and home. You were even generous in the amount you deprived yourself of out of the $100,000, for less would have been enough. Caught with $10,000 of the bank's money in a steamship ticket made out in a fictitious name, it was prima facie evidence that he had done the job and had the balance somewhere. What would his denials, his protestations of innocence count for? He was an ex-convict, a hardened criminal, caught red-handed with a portion of the proceeds of robbery. He had succeeded in hiding the remainder of it too cleverly, that was all. Carling's face was ghastly. His hands went out again. Again his tongue moistened his dry lips. He whispered, Isn't there some way we can fix this?" And then Jimmie Dale laughed, not pleasantly. "Yes, there's a way, Carling," he said grimly. "That's why I'm here." He picked up a sheet of writing paper and pushed it across the desk, then a pen, which he dipped into the inkstand and extended to the other. "The way you'll fix it will be to write out a confession exonerating Moyne." Carling shrank back into his chair, his head huddling into his shoulders. "No!" he cried. "I won't! I can't! My God, I won't!" The automatic in Jimmie Dale's hand edged forward the fraction of an inch. "I have not used this yet. You understand now why, don't you?" he said under his breath. "No, no." Carling pushed away the pen. "I'm ruined as it is. But this would mean the penitentiary, too." "Where you try to send an innocent man in your place, you hound. Where you Some other way, Carling was babbling. "Let me out of this. For God's sake, let me out of this." "Carling," said Jimmie Dale hoarsely, "I stood beside a little bed tonight and looked at a little baby girl with golden hair, who smiled as she slept." Carling shivered and passed a shaking hand across his face. "Take this pen," said Jimmie Dale monotonously. "Or this." The automatic lifted until the muzzle was on a line with Carling's eyes. Carling's hand reached out, still shaken, and took the pen, and his body, dragged limply forward, hung over the desk. The pen splattered on the paper. A bead of sweat spurting from the man's forehead dropped to the sheet. There was silence in the room. A minute passed, another. Carling's pen travelled haltingly across the paper then, with a queer, low cry as he signed his name. He dropped the pen from his fingers and, rising unsteadily from his chair, stumbled away from the desk towards a couch across the room. An instant Jimmie Dale watched the other, then he picked up the sheet of paper. It was a miserable document, miserably scrawled. "I guess it's all up. I guess I knew it would be some day. Moyne hadn't anything to do with it. I stole the money myself from the bank tonight. I guess it's all up. Thomas H. Carling." From the paper, Jimmie Dale's eyes shifted to the figure by the couch, and the paper fluttered suddenly from his fingers to the desk. Carling was reeling, clutching at his throat. A small glass vial rolled upon the carpet, and then, even as Jimmie Dale sprang forward, the other pitched headlong over the couch, and in a moment it was over. Presently Jimmie Dale picked up the vial and dropped it back on the floor again. There was no label on it, but it needed none. The strong, penetrating odor of bitter almonds was telltale evidence enough. It was prussic, or hydrocyanic acid, probably the most deadly poison and the swiftest in its action that was known to science. Carling had provided against that some day in his confession. For a little space, motionless, Jimmie Dale stood looking down at the silent, outstretched form. Then he walked slowly back to the desk and slowly, deliberately picked up the signed confession and the steamship ticket. He held them an instant, staring at them, then methodically began to tear them into little pieces, a strange, tired smile hovering on his lips. The man was dead now. There would be disgrace enough for someone to bear, a mother perhaps, who knew, and there was another way now, since the man was dead. Jimmie Dale put the pieces in his pocket, went to the safe, opened it, and took out a parcel, locked the safe carefully, and carried the parcel to the desk. He opened it there. Inside were nearly 24 little packages of $100 bills. The other 2 packages that he had brought with him he added to the rest. From his pocket he took out the thin metal insignia case, and with the tiny tweezers lifted up one of the gray-colored, diamond-shaped paper seals. He moistened the adhesive side, and, still holding it by the tweezers, dropped it on his handkerchief and pressed the seal down on the face of the topmost package of banknotes. He tied the parcel up then, and, picking up the pen, addressed it in printed characters. Hudson Mercantile National Bank, New York City. District Messenger, some way, in the morning, he murmured. Jimmie Dale slipped his mask into his pocket and, with the parcel under his arm, stepped to the door and unlocked it. He paused for an instant on the threshold for a single, quick, comprehensive glance around the room, and then passed on out into the street. At the corner he stopped to light a cigarette, and the flame of the match spurting up disclosed a face that was worn and haggard. He threw the match away, smiled a little wearily, and went on. The Gray Seal had committed another crime. End of Part 1, Chapter 6C.
Part 1, Chapter 7A of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Lars Rolander. Part 1. The Man in the Case. Chapter 7A. The Thief. Choosing between the snowy napery, the sparkling glass and silver, the cosy shaded table lamps, the famous French chef of the ultra-exclusive St. James Club, his own home on Riverside Drive, where a dinner fit for an epicurean and served by Jason, that most perfect of butlers, awaited him, and Marlianne's, Jimmie Dale, driving in alone in his touring car from an afternoon's golf, had chosen Marlianne's. Marlianne's, if such a thing as bohemianism, or rather a concrete expression of it exists, was bohemian. A two-piece string orchestra played valiantly to the accompaniment of a hoarse-throated piano, and between courses the diners took up the refrain. And, as it was always between courses, with someone, the place was a bedlam of noisy riot. Nevertheless, it was Marlianne's, and Jimmie Dale liked Marlianne's. He had dined there many times before, as he had just dined in the person of Jimmie Dale, the millionaire, his high-priced imported car at the curb of the shabby street outside, and he had dined there, disreputable in attire, seedy in appearance, with the police yelping at his heels, as Larry the Bat. In either character, Marlianne's had welcomed him with equal courtesy to its spotted linen and most excellent table d'hote, with vin ordinaire for 50 cents. And now, in the act of reaching into his pocket for the change to pay his bill, Jimmie Dale seemed suddenly to experience some difficulty in finding what he sought, and his fingers went fumbling from one pocket to another. Two men at the table in front of him were talking. Their voices, over a momentary lull in violin squeaks, talk, laughter, singing, and the clatter of dishes reached him. Carling! Commit suicide! Not on your life! No, of course it didn't. It was that cursed Gray Seal croaked him, just as sure as you sit in that chair. The other grunted. Yes, but what did the Gray Seal want to pinch 100,000 out of the bank for, and then give it back again the next morning? What's he done 100 other things for to cover up the real object of what he's after? Retorted the first speaker, with a short, vicious laugh. Then, with a thump of his fist on the table, the man's a devil, a fiend, and anywhere else but New York he'd have been caught and sent to the chair where he belongs long ago, and a burst of ragtime drowned out the man's words. Jimmie Dale placed a 50-cent piece and a tip beside it on his dinner check, pushed back his chair, and rose from the table. There was a half tolerantly satirical, half angry glint in his dark, steady eyes. It was not only the police who yelped at his heels, but every man, woman, and child in the city. The man had not voiced his own sentiments, he had voiced the sentiments of New York. And it was quite on the cards that if he, Jimmie Dale, were ever caught, his destination would not even be the death cell and the chair at Sing Sing. His fellow citizens had reached a pitch where they would be quite capable of literally tearing him to pieces if they ever got their hands on him. And yet there were a few, a very few, a handful out of 5 millions, who sometimes remembered perhaps to thank God that the Gray Seal lived. That was his reward, that, and she, whose mysterious letters prompted and impelled his, the Gray Seal's acts. She, nameless, fascinating in her brilliant resourcefulness, amazing in her power, a woman whose life was bound up with his and yet held apart from him in the most inexplicable, absorbing way, a woman he had never seen, save for her gloved arm in the limousine that night, who at one unexpected moment projected a dazzling impersonal existence across his path, and the next, leaving him battling for his life, where greed and passion and crime swirled about him, was gone. Jimmie Dale threaded the small, crowded rooms. The interior of Marlianne's had never been altered from the days when the place had been a family residence of some pretension, and reaching the hall, received his hat from the frowsy looking boy in attendance. He passed outside, and at the top of the steps paused as he took his cigarette case from his pocket. It was nearly a week since Carling, the cashier of the Hudson Mercantile National Bank, had been found dead in his home, a bottle that had contained hydrocyanic acid on the floor beside him. Nearly a week since bookkeeper Bob, unaware that he had ever been under temporary suspicion for the robbery of the bank, had, equally unknown to himself, been cleared of any complicity in that affair. And yet, as witness the conversation of a moment ago, it was still the topic of New York, still the vital issue that filled the maw of newspapers with ravings, threats, and execrations against the Gray Seal, snarling virulently the while at the police for the latter's ineptitude, inefficiency, and impotence. Jimmie Dale closed his cigarette case with a snap that was almost human in its irony, dropped it back into his pocket, and lighted a match. But the flame was arrested halfway to the tip of his cigarette, as his eyes fixed suddenly and curiously on a woman's form hurrying down the street. She had turned the corner before he took his eyes from her, and the match between his fingers had gone out. Not that there was anything very strange in a woman walking, or even half running, along the street, nor that there was anything particularly attractive or unusual about her, and if there had been, the street was too dark for him to have distinguished it. It was not that. It was the fact that she had neither passed by the house on whose steps he stood, nor come out of any of the adjoining houses. It was as though she had suddenly and miraculously appeared out of thin air, and taken form on a sidewalk a little way down from Marlianne's. "That's queer," commented Jimmie Dale to himself. However, he took out another match, lighted his cigarette, jerked the match stub away from him, and, with a lift of his shoulders, went down the steps. He crossed the pavement, walked around the front of his machine, since the steering wheel was on the side next to the curb, and, with his hand out to open the door, stopped. Someone had been tampering with it. It was not quite closed. There was no mistake. Jimmie Dale made no mistakes of that kind. A man whose life hung a dozen times a day on little things could not afford to make them. He had closed it firmly, even with a bang, when he had got out. Instantly suspicious, he wrenched the door wide open, switched on the light under the hood, and, with a sharp exclamation, bent quickly forward. A glove, a woman's glove, a white glove, lay on the floor of the car. Jimmie Dale's pulse leaped suddenly into fierce pounding beats. It was hers. He knew that intuitively, knew it as he knew that he breathed. And that woman he had so leisurely watched as she disappeared from sight must have been she. He sprang from the car with a jump, his first impulse to dash after her, and checked himself, laughing a little bitterly. It was too late for that now. He had already let his chance slip through his fingers. Around the corner was Sixth Avenue, surface cars, the elevated, taxicabs, a multitude of people, and any one of 100 ways in which she could and would already have discontinued pursuit from him. And, besides, he would not even have been able to recognize her if he saw her. Jimmie Dale's smile was mirthless as he turned back to the car and picked up the glove. Why had she dropped it there? It could not have been intentional. Why had He began to tear suddenly at the glove's little finger, and in another second, kneeling on the car step, his shoulders inside, he was holding a ring, close under the little electric bulb. It was a gold seal ring, a small, dainty thing that bore a crest, a bell surmounted by a bishop's mitre, the bell, quaint in design, harking the imagination back to some old-time belfry tower, and underneath, in the scroll, a motto. It was a full minute before Jimmie Dale could decipher it, for the lettering was minute and the words, of course, reversed. It was in French: Sonnez le tocsin. He straightened up, the glove and ring in his hand, a puzzled expression on his face. It was strange. Had she, after all, dropped the glove there intentionally? Had she at last let down the barriers just a little between them, and given him this little intimate sign that she And then Jimmie Dale laughed abruptly, self-mockingly. He was only trying to deceive himself, to argue himself into believing what with heart and soul he wanted to believe. It was not like her, and neither was it so. His eyes had fixed on the seat beside the wheel. He had not used the lap rug all that day. He couldn't use a rug and drive. He had left it folded and hanging on the rack in the tonneau. It was now neatly folded and reposing on the front seat. "Yes," said Jimmie Dale, a sort of self-pity in his tones. "I might have known." He lifted the rug. Beneath it, on the leather seat, lay a white envelope. Her letter. The letter that never came save with the plan of some grim, desperate work outlined ahead, the call to arms for the Gray Seal. Sonnez le tocsin. Ring the tocsin. Sound the alarm. The tocsin. The words were running through his brain. A strange motto on that crest, that seemed so strangely apt. The tocsin. Never once in all the times that he had heard from her, never once in the years that had gone since that initial letter of hers had struck its first warning note, had any communication from her been but to sound again a new alarm. The Tocsin! The Tocsin! The words seemed to visualize her, to give her a concrete form and being, to breathe her very personality. The Tocsin! Jimmie Dale whispered the word softly, a little wistfully. "Yes, I shall call you that. The Tocsin." He folded the glove very carefully, placed it with the ring in his pocketbook, picked up the letter, and, with a sharp exclamation, turned it quickly over in his fingers, then bent hurriedly with it to the light. Strange things were happening that night. For the first time the letter was not even sealed. That was not like her either. What did it mean? Quick, alert now, anxious even, he pulled the double folded sheets from the envelope, glanced rapidly through them, and, after a moment, a smile, whimsical, came slowly to his lips. It was quite plain now, all of it. The glove, the ring, and the unsealed letter. And the postscript held the secret. Or rather, what had been intended for a postscript did, for it comprised only of a few words, ending abruptly, unfinished. "Look in the cupboard at the rear of the room. The man with the red wig is—" That was all, and the words written in ink were badly blurred, as though the paper had been hastily folded before the ink was dry. It was quite plain. and, in view of the real explanation of it all, eminently characteristic of her. With the letter already written she had come there, meaning to place it on the seat and cover it with a rug, as indeed she had done. Then, deciding to add the postscript, and because she would attract less attention that way than in any other, she had climbed into the car as though it belonged to her, and had seated herself there to write it. She would have been hurried in her movements, of course, and in pulling off her glove to use the fountain pen the ring had come with it. The rest was obvious. She had just begun to write when he had appeared on the steps. She had slipped instantly down to the floor of the car, probably dropping the glove from her lap, hastily enclosed the letter in the envelope which she had no time to seal, thrust the envelope under the rug, and, forgetting her glove, and fearful of risking his attention by attempting to close the door firmly, had stolen along the body of the car, only to be noticed by him too late, when she was well down the street. And at that latter thought once more chagrin seized Jimmie Dale. Then he turned impulsively to the letter. All this was extraneous, apart for another time when every moment was not a priceless asset, as it very probably was now. Dear philanthropic crook. It always began that way, never any other way. He read on more and more intently, crouched there close to the light on the floor of his car, lips thinning as he proceeded, read it to the end, absorbing, memorizing it, and then the abortive postscript. Look in the cupboard at the rear of the room. The man with the red wig is... For an instant, as mechanically he tore the letter into little shreds, he held there hesitant, and the next, slamming the door tight, he flung himself into the seat behind the wheel, and the big 60 horsepower self-starting machine was roaring down the street. The Tocsin! There was a grim smile on Jimmie Dale's lips now. The alarm! Yes, it was always an alarm, quick, sudden, an emergency to face on the instant. Plans, decisions to be made with no time to ponder them, with only that one fact to consider, staggering enough in itself, that a mistake meant disaster and ruin to someone else, and to himself, if the courts were merciful where he had little hope for mercy, the penitentiary for life. And now, tonight again, as it almost always was when these mysterious letters came, every moment of inaction was piling up the odds against him. And, too, the same problem confronted him. How, in what way, in what role must he play the night's game to its end? As Larry the Bat? The car was speeding forward. He was heading down Broadway now, lower Broadway, that stretched before him, deserted like some dark, narrow canyon where far below, like towering walls, the buildings closed together and seemed to converge into some black, impassable barrier. The street lights flashed by him. A patrolman stopped the swinging of his nightstick and turned to gaze at the car that rushed by at a rate perilously near to contempt of speed laws. Streetcars passed at indifferent intervals. Pedestrians were few and far between. It was the lower Broadway of night. Larry the Bat? Jimmie Dale shook his head impatiently over the steering wheel. No, that would not do. It would be well enough for this young Burton, perhaps, but not for old Isaac, the East Side Fence. For Isaac knew him in the character of Larry the Bat. His quick, keen brain, weaving, eliminating, devising, scheming, discarded that idea. The final coup of the night, as yet but sensed in an indefinite, unshaped way, if enacted in the person of Larry the Bat, would therefore stamp Larry the Bat and the Gray Seal as one, a contretemps but little less fatal, in view of old Isaac, than to bracket the Gray Seal and Jimmie Dale. Larry the Bat was not a character to be assumed with impunity, nor one to jeopardize. It was a bulwark of safety, as it were, to which more than once he owed escape from capture and discovery. He lifted his shoulders with a sudden jerk of decision as the car swerved to the left and headed for the East Side. There was only one alternative then, the black silk mask that folded into such tiny compass, and that, together with an automatic and the curious thin metal case that looked so like a cigarette case, was always in his pocket for an emergency. The car turned again, and approaching its destination, Jimmie Dale slowed down the speed perceptibly. It was a strange case, not a pleasant one, and the raw edges where they showed were ugly in their nakedness. Old Isaac Pelina, young Burton, and Maddon K. Wilmington. Maddon, the wallpaper magnate. Curious that of the three he should already know two, old Isaac and Maddon. Everybody in the East Side, every denizen of the underworld, and many who posed on a far higher plane knew old Isaac, fence to the most select clientele of thieves in New York, unscrupulous, hand in glove with any rascality or crime that promised profit, a money lender, a Shylock without even a Shylock's humanity as a saving grace. Yes, as Larry the Bat he knew old Isaac, and he knew him not only personally, but by first-hand reputation. He had heard the man cursed in blasphemous, whole-souled abandon by more than one crook who was in the old fence's toils. They dealt with him, the crooks, while they swore to get him because he was safe. But Jimmie Dale's lips parted in a mirthless smile. Some day old Isaac would be found in that spider's den of his back of the dingy loan office with a knife in his heart or a bullet through his head. And K. Wilmington Maddon, Jimmie Dale's smile grew whimsical. He had known Maddon quite intimately for years, had even dined with him at the St. James Club only a few nights before. Maddon was a man in his own set, and Maddon, interfered with, was likely to prove none too tractable a customer to handle, and young Burton, the letter said, was Maddon's private and confidential secretary. Jimmie Dale's lips thinned again. Well, Burton's acquaintance was still to be made. It was a curious trio, and it was dirty work, more raw than cunning, more devilish than ingenious, blackmail in its most hellish form. The stake, at the least calculation, a cool $500,000, a heavy price for a single slip in a man's life. He brought the car abruptly to a halt at the edge of the curb, and sprang out to the ground. He was in the front of the Budapest restaurant, most popular of all resorts for the moment on the East Side, where Fifth Avenue, in the fond belief that it was seeing the real thing in seamy life, engaged its table a week in advance. Jimmie Dale pushed a bill into the door attendant's hand, accompanied by an injunction to keep an eye on the machine, and entered the cafe. End of Part 1, Chapter 7a. The Thief. From The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Read by Lars Rolander. Part 1, Chapter 7b. Of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Lars Rolander. Part 1. The Man in the Case. Chapter 7b. The Thief. Continued. But for a sort of tinselled ostentation the place might well have been the Marlianne's that he had just left. It was crowded, and riot was at its height. A stringed orchestra in Hungarian costume played what purported to be Hungarian airs. Shouts, laughter, clatter of dishes, and thump of stains added to the din. He made his way between the close-packed tables to the stairs, and descended to the lower floor. Here, if anything, the confusion was greater than above. But here, too, was an exit through to the rear street, and a moment later he was sauntering past the front of an unkempt little pawnshop, closed for the night, over whose door, in the murk of a distant street lamp, three balls hung in sagging disarray, tawny with age, and across whose dirty, unwashed windows, letters missing, ran this legend: Is Ak Pelina Pawn Brook The pawnshop made the corner of a very dark and narrow lane, and with a quick glance round him to assure himself that he was unobserved, Jimmie Dale stepped into the alleyway, and, lost instantly in the blacker shadows, stole along by the wall of the pawnshop. Old Isaac's business was not all done through the front door. And then, suddenly, Jimmie Dale shrank still, closer against the wall. Was it intuition, premonition, or reality? There seemed an uncanny feeling of presence around him, as though perhaps he were watched, as though others beside himself were in the lane. Yes, ahead of him a shadow moved. He could just barely distinguish it now that his eyes had grown accustomed to the darkness. It, like himself, was close against the wall, and now it slunk noiselessly down the length of the lane until he lost sight of it. And what was that? He strained his ears to listen. It seemed like a window being opened or closed cautiously, stealthily, the fraction of an inch at a time. And then he located the sound. It came from the other side of the lane, and very nearly opposite to where, on the second floor, a dull yellow glow shone out from old Isaac's private den in the rear of the pawnshop's office. Jimmie Dale's brows were gathered in sharp furrows. There was evidently something afoot tonight, of which the Tocsin had not sounded the alarm. And then the frown relaxed, and he smiled a little. Miraculous as was the means through which she obtained the knowledge that was the basis of their strange partnership, it was no more miraculous than her unerring accuracy in the minutest details. The Tocsin had never failed him yet. It was possible that something was afoot around him, quite probable indeed, since he was in the most vicious part of the city, in the heart of gangland. But whatever it might be, it was certainly extraneous to the mission, or she would have mentioned it. The lane was empty now, he was quite sure of that, and there was no further sound from the window opposite. He started forward once more, only to halt again, for the second time as abruptly as before, squeezing, if possible, even more closely against the wall. Someone had turned into the lane from the sidewalk, and, walking hurriedly, choosing with evident precaution the exact centre of the alleyway, came toward him. The man passed, his hurried stride a half run, and, a few feet beyond, halted at old Isaac's side door. From somewhere inside the old building, Jimmie Dale's ears caught the faint ringing of an electric bell, a long ring, followed in quick succession by three short ones. Then the repeated clicking of a latch, as though pulled by a cord from above, and the man passed in through the door, closing it behind him. Jimmie Dale nodded to himself in the darkness. It was a spring lock. The signal was one long ring and three short ones. The Tocsin had not missed even those small details. Also, Burton was late for his appointment, for that must have been Burton. Business such as old Isaac had in hand that night would have permitted the entrance of no other visitor but K. Wilmington Maddon's private secretary. He moved down the lane to the door and tried it softly. It was locked, of course. The slim, tapering, sensitive fingers, whose tips were eyes and ears to Jimmie Dale, felt over the lock, and a slender little steel instrument slipped into the keyhole. A moment more and the catch was released, and the door, under his hand, began to open. With it ajar, he paused, his eyes searching intently up and down the lane. There was nothing, no sign of anyone, no moving shadows now. His gaze shifted to the window opposite. Directly facing it now, with a dull reflection upon it from the lighted window of old Isaac's den above his head, he could make out that it was open. But that was all. Once more he smiled, a little tolerantly at himself this time. Someone had been in the lane, someone had opened the window of his or her room in that tenement house across from him. Surely there was nothing surprising, unnatural, or even out of the commonplace in that. He had been a little bit on edge himself, perhaps, and the sudden movement of that shadow, unexpected, had startled him for the moment, as in all probability the opening of the window had startled the skulking figure itself into action. The door was open now. He stepped noiselessly inside and closed it noiselessly behind him. He was in a narrow hall, where a few yards away a light shone down a stairway at right angles to the hall itself. Rear door of pawnshop opens into hall, and exactly opposite very short flight of stairs leading directly to doorway of Isaac's den above. Ramshackle old place, low ceilings. Isaac, when sitting in his den, can look down and, by means of a transom over the rear door of the shop, see the customers as they enter from the street, while he also keeps an eye on his assistant. Latter always locks up and leaves promptly at 6 o'clock. Jimmie Dale was subconsciously repeating to himself snatches from the Tocsin's letter, which, as subconsciously in reading, he had memorized almost word for word. And now voices reached him, one excited, nervous, as though the speaker were labouring under mental strain that bordered closely on the hysterical; the other curiously mingling querulousness with an attempt to pacify, but dominantly contemptuous, sneering, cold. Jimmie Dale moved along the hall very slowly, without a sound, testing each step before he threw his body weight from one leg to the other. He reached the foot of the stairs. The Tocsin had been right. It was a very short flight. He counted the steps. There were 8. Above, facing him, a door was open. The voices were louder now. It was a sordid looking room, what he could see of it, poverty stricken in its appearance, intentionally so probably for effect, with no attempt whatever at furnishing. He could see through the doorway to the window that opened on the alleyway, or, rather, just glimpsed the top of the window at an angle across the room. That and a bare street of floor. The two men were not in the line of vision. Burton's voice, it was unquestionably Burton speaking, came to Jimmie Dale now distinctly. "No, I didn't. I tell you, I didn't. I hadn't the nerve." Jimmie Dale slipped his black silk mask over his face, and with extreme caution, on hands and knees, began to climb the stairs. "So," it was old Isaac now, in a half purr, half sneer, "and I was so sure, my young friend, that you had. I was so sure that you were not such a fool. Yes, I could even have sworn that they were in your pocket now, what? It is too bad, too bad. It is not a pleasant thing to think of, that little chair up the river in its horrible little room where—" "For God's sake, Isaac, not that! Do you hear? Not that! My God, I didn't mean to. I didn't know what I was doing." Jimmie Dale crept up another step, another and another. There was silence for a moment in the room. Then Burton again, hoarse voiced: "Isaac, I'll make good to you some other way. I swear I will. I swear it. If I'm caught at this I'll get 15 years for it." "And which would you rather have?" Jimmie Dale could picture the oily smirk, the shrug of his shoulders, the outthrust hands, palms upwards, elbows in at the hips, the fingers curved and wide apart. 15 years, or what you get for murder? Eh, my friend, you have thought of that, eh? It is a very little price I ask, yes?" "Damn you!" Burton's voice was shrill, then dropped to a half sob. "No, no, Isaac, I didn't mean that. Only, for God's sake, be merciful. It is not only the risk of the penitentiary, it's more than that. I tried to play white all my life, and until that cursed night there's no man living could say I haven't. You know that, Isaac. I tell you. I couldn't do it this afternoon. I tell you I couldn't. I tried to and I couldn't." Jimmie Dale was lying flat on the little landing now, peering into the room. Back a short distance from the doorway a repulsive looking little man in unkempt clothes and soiled linen, with yellowish skinned, parchment face out of which small black eyes shone cunningly and shrewdly, sat at a bare deal table in a rickety chair. Facing him across the table stood a young man of no more than 25, clean cut, well dressed, but whose face was unnaturally white now, and whose hand, as he extended it in a pleading gesture toward the other, trembled visibly. Jimmie Dale's hand made its way quietly to his side pocket and extracted his automatic. Old Isaac humped his shoulders and leered at his visitor. "We talk a great deal, my young friend. What is the use? A bargain is a bargain. A few rubies in exchange for your life. A few rubies and my mouth is shut. Otherwise—" he humped his shoulders again. "Well?" Burton drew back, swept his hand in a dazed way across his eyes, and laughed out suddenly in bitter mirth. "A few rubies!" he cried. "The most magnificent stones of this side of the water! A few rubies! It's been Maddon's life hobby. Every child in New York knows that. A few! Yes, there's only a few, but those few are worth a fortune. He trusts me. The man has been like a father to me, and—" "So you are the very last to be suspected," observed old Isaac suavely. "Have I not told you that? There is nothing to fear. Did we not arrange everything so nicely, eh, my young friend? See, it was to-night that Maddon gives a little reception to his friends, and did you not say that the rubies would be taken from the safe deposit vault this afternoon, since his friends always clamour to see them as a very fitting conclusion to an evening's entertainment? And did you not say that you very naturally had access to the safe in the library where you worked, and that he would not notice they were gone until he came to look for them sometime this evening? I think you said all that. And what suspicion, let alone proof, would attach itself to you? You were out of the room once when he, too, was absent for perhaps half an hour. It is very simple. In that half hour someone, somehow, abstracted them. Certainly it was not you. You see how little I ask, and I pay well, do I not? And so I gave you until to-night. 3 days have gone and I have said nothing, and the body has not been found, eh? But to-night, eh? It was understood. The rubies or the chair?" Burton's lips moved, but it was a moment before he could speak. "You wouldn't dare!" he whispered thickly. "You wouldn't dare! I tell the story of what you tried to make me do, and they send you up for it." Old Isaac shrugged with pitying contempt. "Is it after all a fool I'm dealing with?" he sneered. "And what should I say? That you had stolen the stones from your employer and offered them as a bribe to silence me, and that I had refused? The very act of handing you over to the police would prove the truth of what I said and rob you of even a chance of leniency for that other thing. Is it not so, eh? And why did I not hand you over at once 3 nights ago? Believe me, my young friend, I should have a very good reason ready, a dozen if necessary, if it came to that. But we are borrowing trouble, are we not? We shall not come to that, eh?" For a moment it seemed to Jimmie Dale, as he watched, that Burton would hurl himself upon the other, white to the lips, the muscles of his face twitching. Burton clenched his fists and leaned over the table. And then, With sudden revulsion of emotion he drew back once more, and once more came that choked sob. "You'll pay for this, Isaac. Your turn will come for this." "I have been threatened very often," snapped the other contemptuously. "Bah! What are threats? I laugh at them, as I always will." Then, with a quick change of front, his voice a sudden snarl. "Well, we have talked enough. You have your choice, the stones or and it is tonight. Now." The old pawnbroker sprawled back in his chair, a cunning leer on his vicious face, a gleam of triumph, greed in the beady, rat-like eyes that never wavered from the other. Burton, moisture oozing from his forehead, stood there, hesitant, staring back at old Isaac, half in a fascinated gaze, half as though trying to read some sign of weakness in the bestial countenance that confronted him. And then, very slowly, in an automatic, machine-like way, his hand groped into the inside pocket of his vest, and old Isaac cackled out his derision. "So you thought you could bluff me, eh? You thought you could fool old Isaac? Bah! I read you like a book. Did I not tell you a while back that you had them in your pocket? I know your kind, my young friend. I know your kind very well indeed. It is my business. You would not have dared to come here tonight without the prize. So you took them this afternoon as we agreed. Yes, yes, you did well. You will not regret it. And now let me see them." His voice rose eagerly. "Let me see them now, my young friend." "Yes, I took them." Burton spoke listlessly. "God help me!" Old Isaac, quivering, excited, like a different creature now, sprang from his chair, and as Burton drew a long, flat leather case from his pocket, snatched it from the other's hand. His fingers, in their rapacious haste, could not at first manipulate the catch, and then, finally, with the case open, he bent over the table feverishly. The light reflected back as from some living mass of crimson fire, now shading darkly, now glowing into wondrous, colourful transparency as he moved the case to and fro with jerky motions of his hands, and he was babbling, crooning to himself like one possessed. "Ah, the little beauties! Ah, the pretty little things! Yes, yes, these are the ones. This is the great Arachon. See, see, the six-sided prism, terminated by the six-sided pyramid. Ah, but it must be cut, it must be cut to sell it, eh? Ah, it's too bad, too bad. And this one here, I know them all. This is—" But his sentence was never finished. It was Jimmie Dale on his feet now, leaning against the jamb of the door, his automatic covering the two men at the table, who spoke. "Quite so, Isaac," he said coolly. "You know them all. Quite so, Isaac. But be good enough to drop them." The case fell from Isaac's hand, the flush on his cheeks died to a sickly pallor, and, his mouth half open, he stood like a man turned to stone, his hands, with curved fingers still outstretched over the table, over the crimson gems that spilled from the case, lay scattered now on the tabletop. Burton neither spoke nor moved, a little whiter, the misery in his face almost apathetic. He moistened his lips with the tip of his tongue. Jimmie Dale walked across the room, halted at the end of the table, and surveyed the two men grimly. And then, while one hand with the revolver extended rested easily on the table, the other gathered up the stones, placed them in the case, and, the case in his pocket, Jimmie Dale's lips parted in an uninviting smile. "I guess I'm in luck tonight, eh, Isaac?" he drawled. "Between you and your young friend, as I believe you call him, it would appear as though I had fallen on my feet. That Aracon's worth, what would you say, 100, 200,000 alone, eh?" A very famous stone, that. Had your eye on it for quite a time, Isaac, you miserable blood leech, eh?" Isaac did not answer, but while he still held back from the table, he seemed to be regaining a little of his composure. Burglars of whatever sort were no novelty to him, and was staring fixedly at Jimmie Dale. "Can't place me, though there's not many in the profession you don't know? Is that it?" inquired Jimmie Dale softly. "Well, don't try, Isaac. It's hardly worth your while. I've got the stones now, and " "Wait, listen!" It was Burton speaking for the first time, his words coming in quick, nervous rush. "Listen! You don't " "Hold your tongue!" cried old Isaac, with sudden fierceness. "You are a fool!" He leaned toward Jimmie Dale, a crafty smile on his face, quite in control of himself once more. "Don't listen to him. Listen to me. You're right. I can't place you, and it doesn't make any difference." He took a step forward. "But " "Not too close, Isaac!" snapped Jimmie Dale sharply. "I know you." "So!" ejaculated old Isaac, rubbing his hands together. "So! That is good. That is what I want. Listen, we will make a bargain. We are birds of a feather, eh? Old thieves, eh? You've got the drop on us who did all the work, but you'll give us our share, eh? Listen, you couldn't get rid of those stones alone. You know that. You're not so green at the game, eh? You'd have to go to someone. You know me. You know old Isaac, you say? Oh, well, then, you know there isn't another man in New York could dispose of those rubies and play safe doing it except me. I'll make a good bargain with you." "Isaac," said Jimmie Dale pensively, "you've made a good many good bargains. I wonder when you'll make your last. There's more than one looking for interest on those bargains in a pretty grim sort of way." "Bah!" ejaculated old Isaac. "It is an old story. They are all alike. I'm afraid of none of them. I hold them all like that." His hands opened and closed like a taloned claw. "And you'd add me to the lot, eh?" said Jimmie Dale. He lifted the revolver, its muzzle on old Isaac, examined the mechanism thoughtfully, and lowered it again. "Very well, I'll make a bargain with you, providing it is agreeable to your young friend here." "Ah!" exclaimed old Isaac shrilly. "So that is good. It's done, then." He chuckled hoarsely. "Any bargain I make he will agree to. Is it not so?" He fixed his eyes on Burton. "Well, is it not so? Speak up, say!" He stopped, the words cut short off on his lips. It came without warning, a crash, a pound on the door below, another. Burton shrank back against the wall. "My God, the police!" he gasped. "Maddon found out. We're caught!" Jimmie Dale's eyes on old Isaac narrowed. The pounding in the alleyway grew louder, more insistent. And then his first suspicion passed. It was no game of Isaac's. Crafty though the old fox was, the other's surprise and agitation was too genuine to be questioned. Still the pounding continued. Someone was kicking viciously at the door, and banging a tattoo on the panels with his fists. Old Isaac's claw-like hands doubled suddenly. "It is some drunken sot," he snarled out, "that knows no better than to come here and rouse the whole neighbourhood. It is true, in a moment we will have the police running in from the street. But wait, I'll teach the fool a lesson." He dashed around the table, ran for the window, wrenched the catch up, flung the window open, and, snarling again, leaned out and instantly the knocking ceased. and instantly then, with a sharp cry, as the whole ghastly meaning of it swept upon him, Jimmie sprang after the other too late. Came the roar of a revolver shot, a stream of flame cutting the darkness of the alleyway from the window in the house opposite, and, without a sound, old Isaac, crumpled up, hung limply for a moment over the sill and slid in a heap to the floor. End of Part 1, Chapter 7b. The Man in the Case. From The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Read by Lars Rolander.